Since his cinematic debut in 2008, Iron Man quickly became a household name. So it may be surprising to find out that there was a show airing on Nicktoons starring this hero that quite a few fans choose to ignore, despite the fact it was coming out at the same time the MCU was growing in popularity. This show was Iron Man Armored Adventures. I believe that people disregard this show because of the changes that it makes to the Iron Man mythos. So I think the thing that is most people's biggest problem with the show is actually what makes it one of the most unique pieces of Iron Man media out there. You may be asking yourself, what are these changes they made for the show? Well, the biggest change that most people take issue with is that Tony Stark is a playboy no more, seeing as he's a 17-year-old kid. Armored Adventures retcons Tony's history to where he began building his suits as a kid, and it goes over the last years of his teenage life. But don't worry, Tony isn't alone. The whole gang was pushed on this sliding timeline with him. Rhodey, as Tony's best friend who helps him juggle his high school and superhero life. Pepper, an overexcited classmate of Tony who eventually figures out Iron Man's secret identity. And Happy Hogan, who is just kind of an idiot now, but oh well. A sidebar here, yes, Tony keeps his superhero identity a secret to the public. Iron Man actually had a secret identity in the comics. The MCU changed that norm for the character, but this show brings Tony back to the basics. And I would just like to say, I don't think that Tony being younger is a bad thing. Sure, you can't really show him struggling with his alcoholism or do any of the darker stories Iron Man is known for, but this is a cartoon aimed at kids. They wouldn't have been able to tackle those mature themes anyways. Although, having Stark be a teenager allows for some interesting story elements, like how he handles having a ton of enemies that want him dead. Speaking of enemies, villains are something this show does surprisingly well, especially since there are just so many of them. If you ask someone who only watches the movies to name as many Iron Man villains as possible, how many would they come up with? 3? 4? One of the things I like about Armored Adventures is it does not hold back on the villains. They explore so many of Tony's more obscure adversaries, yet the show still gives them time to breathe and even have character development. None of the villains are ever one note, which brings me to my favorite character, Arthur Parks, the villain known as the Living Laser. Let me give you a little history lesson. Arthur Parks was just another faceless goon working for the Maggia, a nobody. Then one night, while robbing inventions from Stark Industries, Arthur puts on an experimental vest. He was exposed to a great amount of radiation that altered his DNA. He became a living being of pure energy, the Living Laser. Arthur had become unstable. He was a danger to himself and others, so Iron Man needed to stop him, but he couldn't harm Arthur's body, so he attacked his pride. Tony mocked Arthur, told him how stupid he was, someone with near limitless power, and all he was doing was robbing banks. Up until this point, Arthur was a villain with no direction. He even held the whole city hostage, but when he was asked for his demands, he blanked. But that night, Iron Man made Arthur snap. He told the world he wouldn't be a nobody any longer. He vowed to be the guy who kills Iron Man. Flash forward a few weeks, Arthur is in S.H.I.E.L.D. custody, but his body has become very unstable. Tony, realizing his mistake, begins to help Arthur control himself. Tony becomes Arthur's only friend. Then there's a plot thread where Laser finds out Tony is Iron Man, and they battle, then come together again to take down MODOK. It's all a little complicated, but Arthur eventually forgives Tony and even lays down his life for him, his one true friend.
Hang on, Arthur. I'll get you back to S.H.I.E.L.D.
All my life, I was a nobody. Then I get this power and I use it to try and hurt you. The one guy who wanted to help me.
But you saved me, Arthur.
Yeah, imagine that. I'm the guy who saved Iron Man.
Unfortunately, not every villain has that level of character development. However, you can still sympathize with them. Crimson Dynamo, Blizzard, Madame Mask, they all have compelling points with understandable motives. But don't worry, having all those villains does not mean the focus of the show is ever far from the main threat, the Mandarin. The show had a very fresh take on the Mandarin, which I appreciate. He's far from the fake out in Iron Man 3 in 2013. The Mandarin isn't even like his comic book counterpart. Instead, the Mandarin in this show was a teenager named Gene Khan that used Makulan rings to transform into his fearsome alter ego. The gathering of the 10 Makulan rings was a 2-season Infinity Gem adjacent quest. I say this because each individual ring has a different magical property, and the being who has all 10 of these rings becomes nearly all-powerful. The Mandarin's main goal of the show is to obtain all the rings. One of Iron Man's main goals is to collect them before him. Pretty straightforward. Overall, I still really enjoy the show, but still have complaints. Characters like Pepper can sometimes be too obnoxious, and the 3D CGI art style just didn't work. But characters like Arthur Parks, the outstanding voice acting, and the story overall redeems the show in my eyes. So, Iron Man, Armored Adventures, I rated a 7 out of 10, an overlooked show that doesn't deserve its bad rep. Also, come on, that opening song was pretty freaking rad.